Environmental Defense Canada has got a new report out on Ontario climate policies, or lack thereof, or lack of progress. And it seems to me, because I cover a lot of Alberta energy and climate policy and federal energy and climate policy, that this is a characteristic of conservative governments across Canada. And it's a worrying trend. And I'll be talking to Sarah Buchanan from Environmental Defense, but the fact that the federal government is like a climate policy steamroller. At the end of the day, they have the big hammer, and provinces like Ontario and Alberta are going to have to get into line whether they like it or not. So welcome to the interview, Sarah.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So well, first of all, we'll talk about your report and Ontario climate change, and then we can talk about where this is likely going. And I've tipped my hand as to where I think it's going. So let's start with your report, please.
Yeah, great. So what we did is we sat down and looked at Ontario's claim that they are taking action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and fight climate change. They've been promising for a long time that they're going to do that without a price on carbon. And so we looked at their environment plan piece by piece and promise by promise. And then we also looked at Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions, and those emissions are going up. They started rising after almost 10 years of going down. They started rising the year Premier Ford took power. We looked at the policies and also concluded that they're not strong enough to hit the target that they've set out for 2030. But at the same time, the proof is in the pudding, right? So not only are the policies weak, but they're not working. The data is from 2018, and we'll be looking at data from 2019, whenever that comes in, probably in the spring. But at the end of the day, if you're not actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions with the programs that you're putting forward, then what are you doing? That's the whole end goal of these particular policies.
Well, I want to bring up an angle here, because this is especially true for Alberta, which has very high carbon intense oil, but it's also true for other parts of the economy. And we often talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions as fighting climate change, which we should. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's another angle to this, is that you can't run a carbon intense, high emissions economy and expect to be competitive in the coming low carbon future. I mean, that's clearly, there are going to be carbon markets emerging. There's already a big one in Europe. There's a big one emerging in China. There'll be in other places. And if the Ontario and other provinces don't work harder to get their emissions down, then their businesses and so on, they're going to pay an economic penalty. Have I got that right?
Absolutely. And Ontario really risks getting left behind in the transitioning that's happening now around the world to, a global economy that's not based as heavily on fossil fuels. And Ontario is still relying on these kind of outdated policies, and in recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, relying on outdated stimulus ideas to, just build more highways and essentially pollute their way out of this economic crisis. So another thing we've done is taken a look at what have they promised to do on climate change? Are they doing it? And is there anything in there that could actually help stimulate the economy? And as it turns out, there's quite a lot. Helping people to, for example, use less natural gas to heat their homes. That stimulates the economy. Think of all the people, needed to install energy efficient windows, upgrade insulation, things like that. And it's something they've promised to do and haven't done. So we've simply said, why don't you go ahead and implement these programs that could have a pretty positive impact on the economy in Ontario at a really important time. So we want to see that pivot towards, frankly, where most other jurisdictions are going. We've seen a lot of plans for green recoveries, just recoveries. Ontario's is nowhere to be seen.
Well, and there's another context that's really important here, and that's Joe Biden's clean energy plan and his climate policies. But if you look at his his plan, he calls for making America the #1 country in the clean energy revolution. And Ontario is ideally positioned. I mean, it's right across the river from Detroit. It's ideally positioned to take advantage of that. And it seems like it's not being well positioned because of the government's foot dragging.
Right. Yeah, we could be providing a lot of renewable energy for, for those northern states potentially, and instead, the Ford government is cutting back on the renewable energy projects that were supposed to be built. So it's frustrating to see other jurisdictions getting their heads around this, moving forward, repositioning their economies, and to see Ontario moving in the absolute opposite direction and going a place that, is going to leave us with a lot of stranded assets. If we have natural gas pipelines going into the ground now that are supposed to be paying themselves off over, a 50-year timeline, if we're still burning natural gas to heat our homes in 50 years, we've got bigger problems than the economy, quite frankly. So Ontario needs to start thinking a lot farther ahead than they are currently.
So final question, and this comes back to the federal government. I mean, Canada's been criticized forever about, talking big and doing little. And I think with the Trudeau government, that changed. It changed in 2015. It changed again in 2019. And since then, we've seen some additional initiatives come forward. And at the end of the day, the federal government is responsible for national emissions, and they will make governments like Doug Ford's and Scott Moses, Saskatchewan, and Jason Kenney's in Alberta. They'll just impose regulations, impose policies if those governments don't play ball. And how much longer has Ontario got under Doug Ford before Justin Trudeau comes in and says, okay, you're going to have this policy, that policy, we're going to do it for you if you won't do it yourself?
Well, I mean, he's already done that with carbon pricing, but it was not easy. It's a tough slog. It takes a lot of government resources to be fighting these legal battles against each other. And all that money and time would be so much better spent actually fighting climate change rather than fighting each other. So I really hope that the federal government doesn't have to bulldoze in and, regulate everybody into playing ball here to acknowledge that the climate crisis is serious. What I would hope is that provincial governments would wise up and say, all right, if we actually take real action to meet these targets, the federal government will get off our backs here. They just, I think, want to see that real serious actions being taken. So hopefully we'll move towards that. If not, unfortunately, the federal government may have to, bring in the bigger guns here.
Right. Well, a final thought, I'll leave you with this, viewers, and that is that we are in an energy transition. We're moving from fossil fuels to electricity generated by low carbon sources like wind and solar and supported by batteries. And that is the same kind of structural change that happened 100 years ago during the 1920s when we moved from horses and steam to cheap petroleum and internal combustion engines. It's the same kind of huge structural issue. When we keep talking about climate change, which we absolutely should, we should never forget of the structural changes coming in the global economy. And we either get with it or we get, we're still working with horses out in our fields and, using them to deliver our milk. That's the metaphor. That's where we're going if we don't get this together. So thank you very much, Sarah. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Great talking with you.